They boycotted my restaurant opening because it would pressure my brother's bigger plans. Now his startup is bankrupt while my chain has 5 locations. I still remember standing outside my first restaurant at 6 a.m. on opening day, arranging the last of the flowers I'd bought myself because no one else was coming to help. The morning sun was just starting to hit the windows, and I could see my reflection staring back at me, tired, nervous, but determined. I'd been dreaming of this moment for 3 years, saving every penny from my previous job, learning everything I could about the food industry, and pouring my heart into creating something that felt authentically mine. The phone had been silent all morning. No good luck texts, no last-minute offers to help, nothing from the people who should have mattered most. I kept checking it anyway, hoping maybe they'd changed their minds, maybe they'd realized how important this was to me. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't show up. They'd made their position crystal clear 2 weeks earlier when I'd made the mistake of calling to invite them personally. The conversation with my mother had been brief and crushing. She'd used that tone she always used when she thought I was being unreasonable, patient but condescending, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. She told me they couldn't attend because it would put unnecessary pressure on my brother, who was still finalizing his business plan for what she called his revolutionary tech concept. According to her, my rushing into the restaurant business was exactly the kind of impulsive behavior that could make him feel rushed, and they needed to protect his creative process. My father had been even more direct when he'd gotten on the phone. He'd reminded me that we'd always known my brother was the real entrepreneur in the family, the one with the vision and the intelligence to build something truly significant. My restaurant, while nice, was what he called small thinking compared to the innovation my brother was working on. They needed to show unified support for the family's real business future, not get distracted by what he termed a hobby venture. Standing there that morning, watching early commuters walk past my empty restaurant, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was a quiet, burning determination that I'd never experienced before. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, always coming second to my brother's potential, and I was done waiting for permission to succeed. The first customer walked in at 7:15 a.m. She was a woman in her 50s, clearly heading to work, and she ordered our signature breakfast sandwich and coffee. When she took her first bite, her face lit up, and she asked if we were going to be open every morning because this was exactly what the neighborhood needed. I nearly cried right there behind the counter, not from sadness but from pure relief that someone, anyone, understood what I was trying to create. By lunchtime, we had a line out the door. People were taking photos of their food, posting about us online, calling their friends to tell them about the new place they'd discovered. I was running between the kitchen and the front counter, completely overwhelmed but more alive than I'd felt in years. This wasn't just about proving my parents wrong anymore. This was about building something real, something that brought joy to people's daily lives. The weeks that followed were a blur of 12-hour days, constant learning, and gradual improvement. I was making mistakes constantly, ordering too much of some ingredients and not enough of others, struggling with the scheduling software, figuring out how to manage the cash flow. But every day brought new regular customers, people who remembered my name and their usual orders, neighbors who started bringing their friends and family. Meanwhile, my parents continued to share updates about my brother's progress at every family gathering I attended. He was meeting with investors, refining his pitch deck, attending networking events with other tech entrepreneurs. They spoke about his future success as if it were already guaranteed, describing the offices he would have, the employees he would hire, the impact his innovation would have on the industry. I listened politely and shared updates about my restaurant's growing customer base, but I could tell they saw it as cute rather than impressive. 6 months in, I was consistently profitable and starting to think about expansion. The lunch crowd had grown so large that we regularly ran out of seating, and people were suggesting I should open a second location. I was also getting inquiries from people in other neighborhoods who wanted to know if I was planning to expand. The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. The first major turning point came when a food blogger with a significant local following discovered us completely by accident. She'd been running late for a meeting and grabbed lunch from us because we were convenient, not because she'd heard anything special about the food. Her review, published the following week, was glowing. She described our atmosphere as warm and unpretentious, our food as elevated comfort food that felt both familiar and surprising, and our service as genuinely caring rather than performative. The response was immediate and overwhelming. We went from serving maybe 200 people a day to having 400 people trying to get in. I had to hire 3 more employees within 2 weeks just to keep up with demand. The local paper called asking for an interview. Other food bloggers started showing up, and I was getting calls from potential investors who wanted to discuss expansion opportunities. That was when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting and being cautious, instead of trying to manage the growth slowly, I decided to embrace the momentum. I found a second location across town that had been a failed restaurant, negotiated a lease that included most of the existing equipment, and committed to opening our second location within 3 months. The family dinner where I announced this decision was memorable for all the wrong reasons. My parents listened to my explanation with increasingly concerned expressions, and when I finished, my mother asked if I was sure I wasn't moving too fast. She worried that I was getting ahead of myself, that I didn't have enough experience to manage multiple locations, that I should focus on perfecting one restaurant before trying to expand. My father was more direct. He pointed out that restaurant chains were incredibly difficult to manage, that most failed within the first few years, and that I was risking everything I'd built on what he called an ego-driven expansion. He suggested I should wait, maybe consult with some business advisors, definitely talk to my brother about growth strategies since he was learning so much about scalable business models from his startup research. I thanked them for their concern and told them I was moving forward anyway. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, broken only when my brother spoke up to say he thought I was being impulsive and that successful entrepreneurs always took calculated risks rather than emotional ones. He offered to introduce me to some of the business mentors he'd been meeting with, people who could help me think through the expansion more strategically. Something about that offer, the condescending way he presented it as if I were a child playing with grown-up concepts, made me realize I was done seeking approval from any of them. I politely declined his help and changed the subject to his latest investor meetings. He spent the rest of dinner describing his progress, the interest he was generating, the potential funding amounts being discussed. My parents hung on every word as if he were describing the cure for cancer. Update 1. Opening the second location was like reliving that first opening day, except this time I knew what I was doing and I wasn't waiting for anyone else's validation. The night before we opened, I walked through both restaurants, checking every detail, making sure everything was perfect. I had a team of 8 employees now, people who believed in what we were building and took pride in their work. Some of them had been with me since the beginning, and watching them train the new employees at the second location felt like watching a family grow. The second location was successful from day one. We learned from our mistakes at the first restaurant, refined our systems, and created a better flow for both customers and staff. Within a month, we were as busy as the original location, and I was already scouting for a third spot. That was when things with my brother started getting weird. He'd been telling us for almost a year that he was close to securing his first round of funding, that several investors were very interested, that he was just finalizing the terms of the deal. But whenever anyone asked for specifics about his technology or his business model, he'd get vague and start talking about proprietary information and competitive advantages he couldn't discuss yet. At first, I assumed he was just being cautious, the way anyone might be when discussing sensitive business information. But as the months went on, his explanations became more elaborate and less coherent. He'd talk about revolutionary algorithms and disruptive market approaches, but when pressed for details, he'd say everything was still in stealth mode and he couldn't risk revealing too much too early. Meanwhile, my parents continued to treat his venture as the family's real business success story. They'd ask me about my restaurants in passing, usually focusing on practical concerns like whether I was hiring enough help or managing my finances properly. But they'd spend entire conversations discussing my brother's latest investor meetings, the office space he was looking at, the team he planned to build once his funding came through. The disconnect became more obvious when I opened my third location. This one was in a completely different part of the city, a more upscale neighborhood where I had to adjust our menu slightly and redesign our interior to match the local expectations. It was our most ambitious expansion yet, requiring a significant investment in renovation and marketing. The opening was our biggest success to date. We had lines around the block for the first week, coverage in 3 different publications, and a waiting list for our weekend brunch reservations that stretched 2 months out. I was starting to get calls from people in other cities who wanted to know about franchising opportunities, and a regional food magazine wanted to do a feature story about successful local restaurant entrepreneurs. When I shared this news at our next family dinner, my parents congratulated me politely but quickly shifted the conversation to my brother's latest developments. He'd apparently had a breakthrough with his technology and was finally ready to start serious fundraising. He described investor meetings scheduled for the following month, a pitch presentation he'd been perfecting, and the substantial funding round he expected to close by the end of the year. What struck me as odd was how similar his description sounded to conversations we'd been having for months. The details were always changing, different investors, different funding amounts, different timelines, but the basic story remained the same. He was always just about to close a major deal, always on the verge of a breakthrough, always one step away from proving everyone right about his potential. But I was too busy with my own success to worry much about my brother's vague progress reports. I was in the process of opening my fourth location, this one in a neighboring city that represented our first real expansion beyond our home market. I'd also hired my first corporate employee, someone to help me manage the administrative side of running multiple locations while I focused on operations and further expansion. The fourth location required everything I'd learned from the previous three. The local market was different, the competition was more established, and I had to adapt our concept while maintaining the core elements that made us successful. It was the hardest opening yet, but also the most rewarding when it succeeded. By this point, I had 42 employees across 4 locations, was serving thousands of customers every week, and was generating more revenue than I'd ever imagined possible when I'd started planning that first restaurant. I was also getting approached regularly by investors who wanted to help fund more aggressive expansion, franchise partners who wanted to bring our concept to their markets, and industry publications who wanted to feature our growth story. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was achieving exactly the kind of business success my parents had always said they wanted to see from their children, but because it wasn't coming from the child they designated as the entrepreneur, they treated it as somehow less significant than my brother's still theoretical venture. Update 2. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when I got a call that made no sense at first. Someone from the local FBI office was asking if I could come in to answer some questions about my brother. They wouldn't explain much over the phone, just that they were investigating some financial irregularities and needed to understand family relationships and communication patterns. I spent the entire drive to their office trying to figure out what could possibly be going on. My brother had always been secretive about his business details, but I'd assumed that was normal for someone working on innovative technology. The idea that there might be legal issues hadn't even occurred to me. The interview was surreal. They asked about my brother's lifestyle, his spending habits, whether I'd ever seen evidence of the technology he claimed to be developing, whether I knew any of his investors personally. They wanted to know about family dynamics, whether our parents were financially involved in his venture, whether I'd ever been asked to invest or provide references for potential investors. As I answered their questions, I started realizing how little I actually knew about my brother's business. I couldn't name a single specific investor, had never seen his office or met any of his employees, couldn't describe his technology beyond the vague terms he'd always used. When they asked if I'd ever seen a working prototype or demo of his product, I realized I never had. They wouldn't tell me exactly what they were investigating, but they mentioned wire fraud, investor fraud, and something about misrepresentation of business assets. They gave me a card and asked me to call if I remembered anything else that might be relevant to their investigation. I drove home in a state of complete confusion and growing dread. I kept thinking about all those family dinners where my brother had described his progress, all those investor meetings and funding discussions that never seemed to result in actual funding, all those explanations about why his business was still in stealth mode after more than 2 years of development. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I tried to research my brother's company online. I searched for his business name, his technology, his investor relationships, anything that might give me a clearer picture of what he'd actually been building. What I found was almost nothing. A basic website with generic language about innovation and disruption, no product descriptions, no team information, no investor announcements, no press coverage. For comparison, I searched for my own restaurants and found dozens of reviews, articles, social media posts, and business directory listings. We had a clear online presence that reflected our actual operations. My brother's company, despite supposedly being much more significant and valuable, had virtually no digital footprint at all. 2 weeks later, everything exploded at once. The local business journal published a front-page story about a federal investigation into a local tech startup accused of running a Ponzi scheme. They didn't name my brother initially, but they described a company that had raised money from investors by claiming to have revolutionary technology while actually having no working product at all. The story explained how the scheme worked. The founder would show potential investors fake demos and fabricated financial projections, use money from new investors to pay returns to early investors, and maintain the illusion of success by renting expensive office space and throwing elaborate networking events. The technology never existed, the team was mostly fictional, and the whole operation was designed to extract as much money as possible from trusting investors before inevitable collapse. My parents called me that afternoon, and I could hear the panic in my mother's voice before she even started talking. The FBI had contacted them, asking questions about their financial relationship with my brother, whether they'd helped him connect with investors, whether they'd been aware of his business practices. My father got on the phone and asked if I'd known anything about problems with my brother's company, if I'd suspected anything was wrong. I told them about my interview with the FBI, about my failed attempts to find real information about his business online, about all the red flags I was now realizing I should have noticed earlier. There was a long silence, and then my mother started crying. Not just sad crying, but the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from having your entire worldview shattered. The next few days brought a steady stream of horrible revelations. My brother's company was indeed at the center of a major fraud investigation. He'd raised over $2 million from investors, none of whom had ever seen a working product because no product existed. He'd been using new investment money to pay fake returns to early investors, to rent expensive office space he never used, and to maintain a lifestyle that made him appear successful to potential new investors. The technology he'd claimed to be developing was completely fictional. The algorithms he described didn't exist, the patents he'd mentioned were never filed, the revolutionary breakthrough he'd been promising was entirely made up. He'd been running the scheme for almost 3 years, starting with small investments from family friends and gradually working his way up to larger amounts from more sophisticated investors. But the worst revelation was still to come. During the FBI's investigation, they discovered that my brother had been using our family name and my restaurant success as credibility markers when approaching investors. He'd been telling people that entrepreneurship ran in our family, that his sister had built a successful restaurant chain, and that our parents were successful business people who supported his venture. He'd even used photos of my restaurants in his pitch materials, implying some kind of family business empire that never existed. When I learned about this, I felt physically sick. Not only had my family dismissed my actual success in favor of his fake achievements, but he'd been using my real accomplishments to give credibility to his lies. The restaurants I'd built through years of hard work and determination were being used as props in his fraud scheme. The legal consequences came swiftly. My brother was arrested on federal fraud charges, with prosecutors seeking prison time and full restitution to investors. The story made national news as an example of how sophisticated fraud schemes could fool even experienced investors. My parents, who had mortgaged their house to invest in his company, faced financial ruin. Final update. The trial was a nightmare that lasted 6 months and destroyed what was left of our family relationships. My brother had been living a completely fictional life, using investor money to lease luxury cars, rent expensive apartments, and maintain the appearance of success that attracted more investors. He'd never developed any technology, never hired any real employees, never had any legitimate business operations at all. The most heartbreaking part was watching my parents in the courtroom, finally understanding that the son they believed in so completely had been lying to them for years. Every investor meeting they'd celebrated, every funding milestone they'd boasted about to their friends, every piece of business advice they'd given me based on his supposed expertise, all of it had been elaborate fiction. During his testimony, my brother broke down and admitted that he'd started the scheme because he couldn't handle the pressure of living up to our parents' expectations. He said he'd felt like such a failure compared to their vision of him as the family entrepreneur that he'd created a fake business rather than admit he didn't have any real ideas. What started as a small lie to buy time had spiraled into a massive fraud that destroyed multiple families' financial futures. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to investors, which was impossible since most of the money had been spent maintaining his fake lifestyle. My parents lost their house, their retirement savings, and their reputation in the community. Several family friends who had invested based on their recommendations stopped speaking to them entirely. Meanwhile, my restaurant business continued growing. I opened my 5th location 3 months after my brother's sentencing, expanded into catering services, and started serious discussions with franchise partners in 3 different states. The contrast between his fake empire and my real success became impossible to ignore, even for my parents. The conversation where they finally acknowledged what had really happened was one of the most difficult of my life. My mother called me 6 months after the trial ended, and for the first time, she talked about my restaurants not as a small side business, but as a real entrepreneurial achievement. She admitted that they'd been so invested in the idea of my brother as the family's business success story that they'd failed to recognize the actual success happening right in front of them. My father was slower to come around, but eventually he asked if he could visit one of my restaurants during the lunch rush, not as a customer, but to understand what I'd built. I watched him observe the operation, the efficiency of the kitchen, the loyalty of our regular customers, the pride my employees took in their work, and I could see him finally understanding that this was real business success, not the theoretical potential he'd been chasing with my brother. The apology, when it finally came, was too little and too late in many ways. They acknowledged that they'd failed to support me when I needed it, that they'd been wrong to dismiss my achievements, that they'd allowed their favoritism to blind them to reality. But the damage to our relationship was already done, and rebuilding trust felt impossible after everything that had happened. Today, I'm running 6 restaurants across 3 cities, employing over 70 people, and in discussions with investors about national franchising opportunities. The business I started in that empty restaurant on a morning when my parents couldn't be bothered to show up has become exactly the kind of family business empire they'd always dreamed of, except it's mine, built despite their lack of support rather than because of it. My brother will be in prison for several more years, and when he gets out, he'll face years of supervised release and financial obligations he'll probably never be able to meet. My parents are living in a small apartment, working jobs they thought they'd never need at their age, trying to rebuild their lives after losing everything to their misplaced faith in his fake success. The irony isn't lost on me that the child they'd written off as lacking entrepreneurial vision ended up building the legitimate business empire they'd always wanted, while the child they believed in completely destroyed their financial future with his lies. But I'm not running my restaurants to prove anything to them anymore. I'm building something I'm genuinely proud of, something that serves my community and provides good jobs for my employees. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if they'd supported my first restaurant opening, if they'd celebrated my real achievements instead of chasing fake ones, if they'd recognized that success comes in many forms and doesn't always look like what you expected. But mostly, I'm grateful that their lack of support forced me to become truly independent, to build something that was entirely mine, and to discover that I was stronger and more capable than any of us had ever imagined.